Disrupted Science, the occasional conversation between the authors of the upcoming book, How the Internet Disrupted Science. I'm Kent Anderson here with my co-author, Joy Moore, and we are recording this on Wednesday, September 24th, 2025. Hey, Joy.
Hey, Kent.
You like my shirt?
I do. That's a
Yeah.
good looking shirt.
If you're watching this, you should buy one. Um, but yeah, we're really I'm really happy with how it turned out. So you never know with these things sometimes. So
Mhm. Well, we just had an amazing conversation with Anita Chan, um, and we're so excited to share it. We touched on so many things that are um, foundational to our understanding of a lot of the things that we're experiencing today. So it was a good education. Um, and
yeah,
I
and speaking
have,
of that, she really brings out what's going on in the university level. I mean, it's reminiscent of what Olivia Guest and Iris Van Roy said in our earlier interview, but definitely, and I think
mhm,
it'll resonate a lot with executives at publishing companies too. So,
mhm. I think my favorite takeaway, there are quite a few, is that not to just dismiss the use of these technologies, but rather to use them to help specific communities
solve
and
particular
understand,
problems, right?
solve particular problems in context.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and the notion that all the problems will solve themselves at scale for everyone should just be, dismissed.
Right, right, yeah. All right. So, without further ado, we're going to turn it over to our interview with Anita Chan. So we're joined today by Anita Chan, who's a professor at the School of Information Sciences and Department of Media and Cinema Studies at the University of Illinois Champaign, Urbana, or Urbana-Champaign, I should say, to
Mm-hmm.
get it right. But we came across her through her book that was recently published with the University of California Press called Predatory Data: Eugenics and Big Tech in Our Fight for an Independent Future. And Joy and I, in writing our book, had come across this eugenics theme, and it seemed a little surprising. It was surprising to us. So it was very reassuring to come across Anita's book and see that someone had really looked at this very carefully and put together a history. And so we're really thrilled to be talking with her today and want to welcome her to Disrupted Science. So welcome, Dr. Chan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Welcome. So nice to meet you.
So can you give us a little background on what you've been researching and what goes into your book and what your current work is like?
Yeah, well, I am a feminist and decolonial scholar of science and technology studies. So my background is in science and technology studies. I have before been looking at the sort of impacts of technology in the global South and had really been essentially looking at the politics of Silicon Valley and its sort of global impacts, really with a focus on the global South for quite a while. And this sort of history of eugenics and big tech and in sort of our datification economy is something really that I started to work on in some ways really as a love letter to my students. I'm now teaching in a STEM-based college in information sciences. Many of my students go on to get careers and sort of think of their degrees as prepping them for careers in Silicon Valley and in technology companies. And sort of as, the sort of coders behind the engines of our datification economy. And for many of them, this sort of connection to eugenics, that the sort of methods that they're learning on a regular basis of statistical regression, all the things that sort of run the predictive economy that are sort of the backbone of the predictive economy that we're now used to from uses of everything from large language models and AI to social media. That's sort of all of that originated with a version essentially of race science and eugenics and race science. They're very disconnected though from that history. They never learned who Francis Galton was.
Mm-hmm.
And so in many ways, sort of the book was an excavation of Francis Galton Galton and eugenics as really the original data scientist. And one someone who was Galton, that is the founder of eugenics, who essentially came up with the method of statistical regression, this kind of predictive methodology, again, for looking through and parsing and filtering quantifiable data. It was a method that he developed essentially out of his own obsession with and anxiety that was quite pitched over 100 years ago at the turn of the century, that the patrician white classes of Europe and the West would essentially end up coming to some kind of degradation because of the kind of growth, demographic growth of change happening in large urban centers, whether London or New York City, et cetera, or Chicago and other metropolitan areas. But looking at changes, the kind of rapidity of change in the West with industrialization and new geographic patterns, he was quite convinced that the sort of new demographics that we were seeing in cities would essentially foretell basically the kind of fall of the West, precisely because there would be a kind of dilution, what he imagined could be a statistically tracked dilution of talent and genius that he believed concentrated more in wealthy, privileged classes, and that new, darker immigrant classes, the sort of poor, etc., had more genetic inclinations, essentially to things like pauperism, poverty, licentiousness, alcoholism, criminality, all the things that make nations weak and that destroy economies and that degrade national strength. He was absolutely convinced that all of this could get statistically tracked. He was already quite obsessed with data collection. And so the book is really kind of excavating, again, the means by which this sort of race science of eugenics is really sort of underpinned, goes to the longest roots in the history
Right, and
of our
it seems to
surveillance
be echoing
economy.
very loudly right now in every dimension that you just outlined, right? I mean, you
And
have
yeah,
the
unfortunate.
paranoia, the classism, the racism, and all of that. One of the more interesting things that you mentioned, you outlined in your book, was how they made people began to see surrendering their data for analysis as a pleasurable thing, as something
Yeah,
that was
can you
good for them. Can you talk a little bit about that and how
yeah,
Yeah.
we've
what
kind of
were the
become
types
inured
of
to that, and we kind of we blow by privacy policies, and we think
Oh,
data
yeah.
collection is inevitable, and there's just nothing we can do about
Completely.
it.
I mean, I think this is one of the kind of really interesting sort of, I don't know, insights, let's say, of like how eugenicists became so successful at their disinformation campaign, is that they sort of were able to recognize kind of early on, one, the kind of need for more outreach. If they were going to really build the sort of utopia that they imagined, around in which in their mind, kind of genius engineers would basically be behind, could be the sort of god figures to designing policy, to be the right hand man or men, and they imagine themselves as all men,
Hmm.
to policymakers, and sort of would get to design and execute national policies in ways that they would execute their own vision of a socially engineered society that would privilege, the kind of genius classes and sort of create civilizations of talent and genius and reproduce this. But they recognize that in order to sort of do this, they didn't need to just sort of come up with methods that they could sort of pass amongst themselves around datification and around means to basically quantify populations and document, again, their belief that talent and genius clustered more amongst the rich and the well-born. And that's why they were rich and privileged, is essentially because they were able to sort of execute um, on their talent and genius. And so they recognize that in order to get this sort of, this worldview in place, they really needed to enroll much more than just themselves and fellow researchers and scientists. Although there were plenty of those, as the book also details, but they also needed to sort of enroll much larger publics, policymakers, but then also do outreach to much broader swaths of Western publics. And Galton, from the get-go, kind of recognized there was a very thin line between creepiness in terms of surveillance, but
Mhm.
also a means of being able to cultivate a certain kind of infatuation
Hmm.
with audiences as they
Mhm.
started to see themselves and recognize themselves as potentially datified. So at the same
Right.
time as he was designing any number of different sorts of surveillance technologies, he had a sort of famous one that I mentioned in the book of a sort of pocket, an invisible pocket handheld counter that he had designed very proudly, that he would slip into his pocket, and essentially it would be a pin pricker on a piece of paper where he could essentially pinprick every time he would sort of quantify a certain kind of population. And in this case, he was trying to create a beauty map of London and would go to rich neighborhoods and go to poor neighborhoods. And in order to sort of execute and collect data to sort of demonstrate his theory that the well-born had more beautiful women in this case, and that the unprivileged classes had fewer, he would stand on the street corners of various London neighborhoods and do this sort of secret counting. Obviously,
Wow,
he
that's
recognized
so
like
I
how
have to just interrupt because that's so reminiscent of Facebook starting out as
I was
the
gonna
hot or
say
not
that's
thing.
the original hot or not.
original, totally. Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah, my students pick up on that immediately too. It's
It's
interesting how
creepy.
it is. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, again, like the kind of modes and the anxieties
Mhm.
of of the techno elite don't go far. I mean, they
Right.
are quite conventional and predictable in many ways.
Yeah.
So he recognized it was obviously creepy, and that's why he designed it as a sort of secret handheld counter. At the
Mhm.
same time, again, in this sort of notion and sort of cultivating a certain kind of fanfare of what it meant to get to see oneself as datafied, he would go to fairs and set up these sort of public booths and these set up a lab essentially that really was institutionalized later at University College London as an anthropometric lab. But he would also extend these into fairs and into sort of public events, essentially inviting the public to come in and do and get things measured from themselves, like acuity of vision, strength of blow, lung capacity, obviously also getting other sorts of biometric details on
Mhm.
physical features and that sort of thing. And again, and they would pay. I think it was something
Right.
like 3 pence for an individual to get datified, but
Right.
essentially for the opportunity to get this kind of record on themselves.
And there was photography at this point involved too, right?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Much of that was not collected with any kind of, but he would essentially, Galton, again, as the original data scientist, was coming up with all forms of experimental methods to, again, essentially create a predictive science where you could sort of get to sort of spot who would be sort of the stronger classes in a society and who would be the sort of ones that society should essentially disinvest from because it was expensive or useless to continue to sort of essentially waste public resources on them.
Hmm.
Was his sort of argument. But yes, he would create these sort of, he had a method of composite portraiture that he published on by 1883 as a kind of famed volume where he was arguing for essentially the use of composite portraiture to be able to predict whether someone was unhealthy, whether someone would be a criminal, and quite famously, whether someone was Jewish or not, to be able to determine. Again, you
Mm.
can sort of see the underpin, all of the kind of race sciences, were quite
Yeah.
amply expressed even through these early methodologies.
Hmm.
And the notion was he would collect these, hundreds of photos from state institutionalized bodies essentially, and then create these sort of composite portraits of individuals, again, to sort of supposedly give, law enforcement and state heads essentially a metric for, right, who's worthy of investment and who's not, who's worthy of increased surveillance because they actually might put others at risk, and who's
Hmm.
not. So all of those things were sort of there from the get-go. In the U.S., the American Eugenics movement and a body called the Eugenics Record Office was enormously successful at essentially also kind of taking further this sort of notion of how much publics could become enamored of their own datification. Again,
Mhm.
recognizing this sort of creepy line between one version of it not wanting to be completely public about what they were doing, but at the
Right.
same time recognizing that they needed to collect data and giving folks also an opportunity. Or what they kind of labeled as an opportunity to kind of see and unlock the secrets of their own sort of family and genetic histories.
Yeah, and you
So they
mentioned
would
in
go
the
door
book
to
that
door.
even decades later, people were calling that office to find out if they had any family secrets or
A- abs-
measurements they needed to know about.
Absolutely. The Eugenics Record Office, even more, they would do the same sort of thing decades later as Galton had in terms of like setting up these sort of public exhibitions and partnering with others like the American Breeders Association so they could be present at fairs. They design museum exhibitions, etc., essentially to educate the general public on the kind of risks that degrading classes pose to them, to essentially teach publics how to put practice into practice the teachings of eugenics into their daily lives, and also to sort of foment a kind of enthusiasm for the kinds of eugenic policies that were starting to roll out by obviously the turn of the century, from the immigration bans that we saw at the turn of the century, initially targeting the Chinese, and then later by 1917 and 1924. Obviously escalating to larger classes, immigrant classes coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, Jewish populations, especially, and in large classes of expanded classes of immigrants coming in from the global South, or what we now recognize as the global South. But also, interestingly, including in that sort of expanded list of banned categories, political anarchists and the disabled, who were both thought to bring in different forms of mental or physical unfitness and potentially be contaminating classes. But again, the Eugenics Record Office was enormously successful at being able to sort of recognize the potential for this public outreach, to sort of personalize a sort of narrative around data and the means by which, if you were in the right version of the information class, you could sort of exercise this as a responsible method of self stewardship, of future stewardship, of your own sort of family, being able to recognize and sort of manage your own daily practices of essentially segregation. To try and keep yourself away from the less well-born or the unfit, to sort of be on the scout for it. And of course, with the kind of records and the data, especially that he was collecting for some families, recognizing themselves as authorized parts of a well-born class. Our Eugenics Record Office was also collecting data on other families very pointedly from and other demographics who were thought to be unfit families, and really in many cases as well, just sort of doctoring data essentially to sort of make it look and appear the way that they wanted it to, essentially to sort of render, right?
Yeah. So you talk a
And
lot about in your book. Sorry, Joy.
the
Go ahead.
Eugenics Record Office was at Cold Spring Harbor, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
And then they shut it down. And I think where Kent and I started to connect some dots to, things that we're more familiar with, the Cold Spring Harbor shut that down. But that it is a center of excellence for genetics research. And so that was, I didn't put these two things together in quite that way.
Yes.
And so then as we're looking at what's being published in the scientific literature, there's some lines are getting blurred. And all that information is still available, historically preserved at Cold Spring, but it's not really being brought to the public for understanding.
I mean, eugenics was very much a vanguard and a powerful movement. I mean, I think that's the thing that for many of my students is really shocking. They sort of remember, if they hear about eugenics, they sort of think about it as associated with sort of Nazi science. That's sort of their kind of, like where their literacy sort of begins and ends, rather than recognizing it actually as quite foundational to the sort of data economy and the surveillance economy that we now have quite normalized or see sort of as built all around us, quite literally built into the statistical methods that are at its very foundation, to sort of the kind of larger politics around around categorization and stratification and segregating populations, and really trying to decide and determine which populations are worth investing in, and which ones are not so worth investing in, or worth pulling essentially safety and security measures away from. And this kind of, again, this sort of notion of like actually the deep history, and that the U.S. is really the kind of training ground and the core exemplar of how far eugenics policy making could go before the Third Reich. That Adolf Hitler looked to American eugenics as really the kind of shining star. And that even for all of the kind of originary power of Francis Galton, it was really the American eugenicists who were able, with the kind of context of U.S. immigration at the turn of the century, of course, the entire West, but in particular, sort of the articulation of the shift from an agricultural to an industrial economy, all of the sort of uh, uh, um, rapid transformation and the kind of public both anxiety and just unsettledness that people were experiencing at the time, not unlike the kind of range of unsettlements and transformations and paradigm shifts that the public is experiencing, and that really well beyond the West, obviously, right now, in terms of a kind of shift to the AI economy, but how it was that eugenicists in the US were really able to exploit all that, again, with the key ingredients of having a kind of optics of difference, to be able to play upon, to sort of demonstrate or to say that they had the sort of methods of science and data to be able to evidence why it was that this thing that you're already a little bit worried about is going to actually lead to some version of personal ruination to your family and to our larger, kind of Western society. And that unless we do something about it, unless we start to execute some of these immigration bans, unless we start to sort of normalize versions of surveillance and population monitoring to start to filter out the unfit, or to at least identify them so that you're not at risk of unknown contamination. And in its, of course, in its most kind of strident forms, we had sterilization laws passed in over 30 states. So, and that
Went all
unless
the way to the Supreme Court, right?
right, exactly,
They
exactly.
found, and
Buck versus
they
Bell
found
case.
in favor of it.
Oh, completely. Exactly. And so my students forget exactly that Oliver Wendell Holmes and that, Supreme Court justices and university presidents, Stanford's first president, David Starr Jordan.
Here comes Silicon Valley.
Precisely, exactly. I mean, they were everywhere. They were really very much a kind of who's who of society, American eugenicists and the leaders of the eugenics movement in the US, that is, were. And that it was very much taken seriously as a kind of vanguard movement and science, not unlike the way that data science and sort of AI is sort of thought of right now as a kind of.
So let's bring it up to today, because it is going on, right? You use a word that in your writing and in your responses to some of our questions when we did an email interview, called majoritarian, right? Majoritarian views. And then you also have this very paranoid white male techno elite on the other side of that, and trying to put out what looks like, because of statistical inference and the power of that in LLMs, basically preserving majoritarian views in the sciences, right?
Right.
And they're rolling it out so quickly and with so little permission and with so little skepticism, as an interview we did earlier with Olivia Guest and Iris Van Roy, in academia.
Yeah.
And elsewhere, just in everyday life on phones and your personal computers. There seems to be, and even Peter Thiel recently said there's kind of a panic, right?
Yeah.
And it's very strange. They're super rich people. They have all.
What are they afraid of?
What are they afraid of, first of all? And what's wrong with them? But it's like,
That is
you got what you wanted. Can you just leave the rest of us alone, please?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But they never can. So I don't know whether that's a question or just kind of a setup.
How do you diagnose what's going on with these sorts
what's wrong? What's their pathology?
Yeah, right. I mean, pathology is exactly the right way to put it. I mean, if you saw that kind of report, we know so many of them really come from really, quite personally broken backgrounds, and you could really, you do wonder what would have happened if they were just earnestly hugged much more when they were
right.
Yeah. So people may have seen the report that just came out on the Times about Elon Musk.
I thought people with bad parents became comedians more often. I really wish that
a healthy way. That's the healthy way
to deal with it.
Well, that is a healthy way of dealing with it, Kent, sort of being able to externalize one's trauma. And like, but yeah, no, I mean, yeah, so in all seriousness, there really is that kind of pattern, but none of that is and their own kind of sense of insecurity is clearly deeply embedded. I mean,
Mhm.
Elon Musk's kind of like the projection that he's now no longer just the richest man on the planet, but that he's going to be a trillionaire.
Mhm.
And
Well,
womanize and all that. I mean, they're afraid of death. They're afraid of
oh, completely.
mortality. They're afraid
Yeah,
of other people. They don't like
completely.
other people,
Yeah.
and they don't
I'm
and they want their views to dominate.
Oh, completely. Yeah. And it's, I mean, it is very much a kind of deeply embedded kind of paranoia around the wider public. I think many of them have been sort of prepping as well for a number of these guys are also preppers, as in sort of
Mm.
for some version of a class warfare and an apocalypse. Even Mark Zuckerberg has got his like, whatever island home in Hawaii, supposedly to try and like, get himself off of out of harm's way should this thing actually emerge.
Well, and
So,
Peter Thiel yesterday said that if we're slow in adopting AI, it'll hasten the arrival of the Antichrist.
right,
So that
right.
that
Oh yeah,
sounds.
no, yeah. So, like
I
all
think I
the
didn't give money to that guy on the street two
yeah.
weeks ago.
No, but they really believe it. I mean, I think the thing
Yeah.
is that they are not much like eugenicists from over 100 years ago. They really thought about this as a survivalist politic. They thought of this
Hmm.
as as existential risk, that this has to happen. Otherwise, the West will fall. Civilization will fall. The world as we know it will no longer exist. And it really is a sort of all like winner take all. And
Hmm.
their kind of version of the world is very much one where it's a zero sum game.
Yeah.
And you can really see that, again, they sort of use some of this. Some of this is quite convenient messaging. Because of course, the more they can sort of play into that, the more they can also sort of convince on other sort of, political heads and leaders to essentially sort of help channel resources towards saving the American AI economy, et cetera. And as I write in the book, I mean, the more we have to pay attention to their own survival, the survival and sort of maintaining the security and safety of this paranoid, hyper elite now, techno eugenic elite, the less we're
Hmm.
actually paying attention to the means by which they've escalated insecurity for everybody else. I mean, when I talk to sort of normal families here in Illinois, and I run a collaboration with some K through 12 teachers in Vermilion County, which is a county in Illinois which it has one of these outsized poverty rates. So it's almost twice the poverty rate in Vermilion County is almost twice what the national average is, which is around 12%. In Vermilion County, it's closer to 20%, and also twice what the state average is in Illinois, which is also around 11 and 12%. Um, but when you talk to teachers there, I mean, the language that they use when they are discussing AI is that they're scared.
Hmm.
And it is really heartbreaking and quite maddening, actually, to hear sort of, folks who are at the front lines of trying to make sure that kids who just normally are not set up and well resourced to be able to graduate, they are the ones who are sort of doing the daily fight to just make sure that those kids still believe in themselves and that they get some version of sort of mentorship, even when other sorts of things around them are just not in place, and they're not set up for that kind of they're not resourced for being able to succeed. So I mean, these are teachers who, again, as I mentioned, like to hear that this kind of version of this language that they not only are scared, but they're scared for their students, and in part it's because they're already starting to see the use of AI
Hmm.
amongst students as young as fifth graders, which would be like 10 years old, and
Hmm.
8-year-olds who are now turning in assignments as well,
Yeah.
using large language models. And when they get a response from the student as to why it is that they're using it, the student says something to them, not unlike what our 20-year-olds might say to us when they're caught in a college classroom doing the same thing, which
Hmm.
is that it just writes so much better than I do. So
Hmm.
the kind of collapse of sort of in learners that are so young,
Hmm.
Again, when we're thinking about a kind of survival politic and what it means for these sorts of these technologies to have generated insecurity at scale, the labor question is obviously, front of mind for many people and working grown-ups and in the US and across the West, where we've seen these LLMs start to play out quite rapidly and get
Yeah, you're
adopted
bringing to
into
mind
large institutions.
a discussion. Ed Zitron interviewed Adam Becker today, and Joy and I, Joy, you've listened to it twice, right? I'm going to listen to it
it,
again.
it was so good. I'm a big fan of both of them. So to have them together today was good.
Yeah,
Oh,
they
good.
started
Yeah.
they started a bromance on that, I'm pretty sure. But one of the things that they talk about is, these fantasies that these tech eugenicist overlords promulgate. One of them is, if we have a trillion people in the galaxy, we'll have hundreds more Einsteins, hundreds more
Yes.
Newtons, and
Yes.
they
Mozart's.
and they
Yeah.
make and Mozarts, yeah, and they make the point that actually, if you invested in education for the children on the planet today in a
Right.
in a real way, you would have those hundreds more Newtons,
Oh, I
Mozarts,
mean,
Einsteins.
that's the argument that tech bros make, but they all know that none of them send their kids. All of them are sending their kids to
To
Montessori type
private school. Yep.
schools and
Yeah.
no screen time, high
Hmm.
teacher to student ratio,
Yep.
or low, sorry, student to
Yeah. Yeah.
teacher to
Yeah.
student.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
lots of human contact and like no screen time. I mean, it's
Mhm.
totally disingenuous, but I will say that for them to start to project that these technologies are sort of genius makers. And we've
Mhm.
heard this since the beginning of the ed tech industry, whatever,
Yeah.
in the 1990s, that, the more computers we introduce into schools and the better investment we are making in our futures. And we've seen what's happened with social media. It took us like, obviously, like we run that experiment
Yeah.
Hmm.
now seeing a different stage of essentially schools starting to organize and create social media and cell phone bans. And now
Right.
countries wholesale sort of trying to execute a version of sort of age verification and at least making a kind of harder lean into what's already sort of on the books regulation in the US, which is COPA, right? Which is, trying to make sure that Child Online Privacy Protection Act,
Hmm.
which is meant to kind of keep kids under the age of 13 from starting social media accounts, but is never actually enforced. So in practice, it's as if COPA doesn't exist.
Mhm.
But now, obviously, after, over well over a decade of like social media use now among students and schools and ample data demonstrating its negative impacts on everything from cognitive, like learning, the sleep deprivation, social deprivation, attention fragmentation, depression rates all going up. I mean, all of this is sort of very well tracked, which is why, schools in both Republican and Democratic areas, this is not a kind of left or right issue by any means. It's really
Hmm.
a lot of families and households and teachers now sort of finally recognizing that there is very, very little evidence to sort of demonstrate any kind of positive cognitive development in the long term, especially for kids. Now we're in the kind of new argument all over. We're relaunching the argument all over again with AI,
Mhm.
Hmm.
with the notion that supposedly we're going to be having, best friend scientists who are tethered on the other line, and it's supposedly not an argument for basically datafying our kids, which
Mhm.
what is actually happening.
But
So
they're what by using, computer science as a model, they're flattening learning and productivity to just outputs.
right.
There's something that goes in and there's something that goes out. And if even these young kids are saying, well, that computer output is better than what I'm doing,
Right.
then they're getting indoctrinated that the output is the goal, not the learning or the curiosity or
Oh,
yeah.
absolutely. I mean, it
Or
collapses the
learning to
whole
handle a
notion.
pencil or whatever it is,
Right,
the
right, right. I
mechanics,
mean,
or
it
just
collapses.
learning to concentrate.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, there's so many there's so many problems with this kind of this kind of use scenario of
Hmm.
that they're projecting of like, just imagine a scientist on the other line, babysitting your kid or something to that effect.
Right.
I mean, it's so problematic on so many levels because I mean, we can already see essentially the companies that are pushing, especially pushing hard into this are the big LLM companies. It's the
Mm-hmm.
OpenAIs and um, who are trying to essentially, who has a partnership now with the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, and with Mattel to develop Barbie dolls and GI Joes right now for kids, which is just horrifying. So much of this is happening, not unlike your last guests were mentioning, where where faculty members are essentially just being pushed away from the table in terms of having conversations around what are the educational impacts of AI on university campuses and higher ed.
Mhm.
How do we want to govern this thing? Even if we don't want to say we want to do a wholesale ban. But very, very similarly, in K through 12 settings, over and over again, teachers and parents are basically told that they have nothing to say or do with this sort of question, and they feel quite distanced and removed from it all. And in so many ways, we're watching a kind of replay of what happened with our social media economy. Even if it's many of the same, we can see very, very similar business models already at play with OpenAI as we have with the social media companies. I mean, right now it's what they're banking on is essentially still an attention economy.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking for scale, and that means they are interested as much in getting users like us in the room. So supposedly PhDs and knowledge workers who can sort of refine their prompts and ask for things that can help us generate better papers, etc. In theory,
Mhm.
as much as they are, or arguably even more, they're looking for much more sort of mundane kinds of users, the kinds of users who would ask very, very kind of normal searches on the internet, which by and large are around, sports, gambling, celebrity news, and yeah, and sort of all the other sort of porn
Mhm.
Right,
and the kind
right.
of
All
other
the
content that
normal,
we know is
all
kind
the
of
normal.
existing on Reddit.
Yeah. So one of the things you talk about in your book are venture philanthropists, right?
Right.
These are they in the guise of being philanthropists, they're actually looking to make a profit, and they're usually technology related people. So one of them that has come into our world is the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is not a
Mm.
philanthropy but an LLC, and they've flipped some of the initiatives that they've started up for hundreds of millions of dollars, and now they're involved in scientific preprints and things like that. And I think they're probably up to some of the same
Oh, interesting.
AI
Mhm.
training and things like that behind the scenes, because they actually made explicit with their grants
Hmm.
that they would have the content available to train their AIs.
Wow.
So, we have all this scientific information going to these LLMs. You have inference engines that are projecting out majoritarian views. That seems like a very basic conflict, because science is about discovery, not about affirmation
Oh,
at the highest level, right?
right.
So
Mhm.
how do you see the tech elite is now meddling in science with
Right.
RFK Jr. And so what's going on here in your view? Just off the top of your head.
I mean, it is a really kind of problematic kind of mix of very obviously quite vested interests. And so the kind of disruption that we see happening already within the scientific community, and what we're seeing, where there's an explosion essentially uh, of plagiarized content, of non-actually like self-authored content that's
Mhm.
kind of
Mhm.
getting, vetted through and pushed into conference applications, etc. I mean that is already something that we've seen explode in the last year or so alone. And it's unclear that there's any kind of, at least from where I sit, it's unclear that there's been any kind of really kind of mindful response around this. And in many ways, they're indifferent to the kind of disruption that's happening within these kinds of circuits of scientific knowledge making that are interested in some version of public stewardship of
Mhm.
knowledge and scientific discovery for a kind of greater public good. If there were, I mean, the kind of the models that to me seem to be much more mindful are the ones where you see initiatives really trying to actually work with working professionals on the ground to try and act like, what does a privacy forward AI application that takes in mind the consideration of teachers, K through 12 educators, um, and working households. What does that look like? And it becomes a very, very kind of specific application as opposed to a kind of application that looks for scale. So the general AI kind of market is one that is obviously pushing for scale. And when you
Mhm.
start to do that, you're already in the game of sort of monetizing attention. And
Yeah.
when you do that, I mean, we've seen essentially what a social media economy
Yeah. Then
generates, which
we're
is
back to square one. One of the
right,
other
right.
things I'm sorry, Joyce, you just got me thinking.
Okay, well, go
But
with it.
I know, finally, huh? Joy's thinking, finally. Um, but one of the things that, so you mentioned earlier about how there's so much pressure in academia to put your AI, wave your AI flag wherever you can, right? I'm doing this with AI, I'm doing that with AI, just because the administrators want to show that their investments in this are paying off and that it's being used. The same thing's happening in scientific publishing circles,
Right.
right? Executives at scientific publishing companies and leadership are being told that they have to include AI statements or how they're going to
Right,
deploy AI
right, right.
and all of that. Have you seen any successful ways to turn that away, to deflect that, to shut it down?
Oh, to shut down the kind of questions around. I mean,
Well, this is kind of the insistence, or to just make the person who's insisting question whether they're insisting on something that they really should be insisting.
yeah. I mean, I point to some of the resistance movements that I look at aren't always around. Not all of them are always around AI. Although I'll mention one that's specific to AI. But you are obviously starting to see, and we started to see real kind of pushback legislatively that demonstrate the kinds of articulations, the recognitions of the kinds of risks these things serve up and are already kind of impacting populations with that scale. And so being reminding our decision makers and sort of like these institution heads that this is part of the ecology too. They're usually not following that. The thing that's easiest for them to see is how company after company is jumping on board with this. They didn't. They may or may not have seen, of course, the MIT report that came out about where they had done a survey of Fortune 500 companies over the summer to ask what percentage of them were actually seeing some kind of financial benefit from their AI based applications that they were rolling out, and 95% of them said they were unclear to none.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I already mentioned the kind of kind of legislative the pushback that we're seeing happening at the local level in various schools, where you're seeing parents start and teachers really have hard no's, like cell phone
Mm-hmm.
bans throughout the kind of throughout the school day, or making very explicit hours of like only when they can use it only during whatever during lunch hours or recess time, etc. As on the ground movements, but also sort of legislative efforts, like what we've seen in Illinois, where there's an AI ban in the realm of therapy,
Mm-hmm.
mental health therapists, and that was a bill that was worked out in consultation with mental health workers and therapists and social workers in the state of Illinois, working with that professional association. In California, I mean, there've been a number of different AI safety bills that have come up, and there's still one. There's 1047, of course, that Newsom did not sign, which was an AI safety regulation that really just sort of, again, the interesting thing about it was that there were several AI companies that were part of the kind of co-development of that. So that already sort of acknowledges how much the industry itself is sort of signaling that it wants better kinds of safeguards that are put in place at the sort of legislative level to reset
Mm-hmm.
essentially the kind of bottom ground.
Right.
Otherwise, there is a kind of race to the bottom for everyone.
Right.
And so that needs to sort of be, again, sort of level set for everyone to make a kind of playing field. But also SB 07, which is an AI in hiring practices. So no AI bosses bill, I think, is what the sort of shorthand bill for that is.
I like
Sort
that.
of recognizing already the means by which these AI systems use to sort of filter through people's applications have already demonstrated quantifiable discrimination, and we know that these kinds of systems are also being used not just for hiring purposes, but also in doing versions of assessment for admittees to to your next cohort for university students. And
Mm-hmm.
there's any again, number of different kinds of applications that we can see it happening, being used across sectors, but demonstrating that there's already, this is, again, the playing field got very, got changed up pretty rapidly with the release of GPT 3.5. So I think everyone had thought that it was going to be self-driving cars that were going to be the kind of killer AI app.
Right.
Before, and we've seen again as well there being a lot more sort of caution precisely because of the kinds of accidents we've seen, even with this kind of like heavy push into monetizing this thing that is the public has real concerns about. And so you see this, the experiments happening city by city by city. LLMs have kind of rolled out with a much faster rapidity, and even still, you're already now starting to see these kinds of legislative emergences. And so, getting those onto the radars of our decision makers, and right. And so, company heads is imperative, just again to acknowledge how much the industry itself is flagging that it needs greater safety, it needs greater precautionary measures.
Well, OpenAI just came out with a report where they said that their LLM is basically always going to come up with bad matches.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because it's on principle. That's how it's built. That's the architecture of it, right?
Yes, correct. Exactly. I mean, OpenAI is again so super disingenuous. So much of what it's trying to do now, we have to be careful that it doesn't do that sort of messaging to essentially reaffirm what its line has been consistently. Now that we see all of these suits that have also again started to emerge around deaths. I mean, the ones that have gotten the most publicity are the underage users. So,
Right.
16 and 14-year-olds who essentially have been in long relationships with LLMs, character AI, and open AI. Quite recently, with months of use of these systems, and at least in the case of the OpenAI LLM, with the ChatGPT user, the 16-year-old did not start off with any kind of intent for a kind of therapy session or friend, was basically just using ChatGPT the way any 16-year-old would for homework, and it gradually ended up pushing more and more into that model. I think when the lawyers for that case ended up getting the kind of transcript of the students' interaction with ChatGPT over 8 months, what they found was that the student had mentioned suicide 43 times, and the LLM ChatGPT mentioned suicide more than 1,000 times.
Wow.
And so there's this
That
kind of
is
really
horrifying.
disparate.
Yeah.
That ChatGPT's OpenAI's kind of defense is that this is still user driven, not that this is a push model, not that we are the ones who are sort of right, that we're getting this into the faces of every user and every teen possible, every potential user, even underage users. So they sort of disavow the kind of push model and say this is all the user. This is all
Well,
user
that's
driven.
one thing that you talk about too in your book, and we talked about earlier, I think, in the interview, is how bad the products are that Silicon
Yeah.
Valley has been rolling out for the past 20 years, 10
Right.
years.
Right.
I mean, they're just bad products, and then they externalize all the development onto the
Yes.
users and the price of that development onto every user, and
Correct.
they don't
Yeah.
have any accountability. And
Right.
Joy and I both come from product development backgrounds, and we're like, that is not the way you do it. That's not responsible product
Yeah.
development.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
opposite.
Yes, yeah. It's the tech companies have this sort of like I mean Section 230 has given them a lot of kind of free reign
A lot of
to
cloud power, yeah.
essentially do a lot of experimentation with publics and see what becomes the most profitable for them, which means just whatever keeps us on like an attention economy much longer.
Yeah. That
And
dopamine going.
they haven't been interested. I mean, like on the product development thing, they aren't delivering education. They aren't delivering. I mean, like ed tech was, kind of my area with the first book. And so, they aren't actually delivering. They can't demonstrate they're actually developing products that support student education. I mean, when we're talking about the big companies, I don't want to disavow, naysay, obviously, some smaller companies that are actually trying to be a little bit intentional about some of these, about the way they do product development. But when we're talking about the big tech companies, what they've been really interested in doing is monetizing attention much more than sort of delivering a product on, let's say, something that, even though they use the mantra of education and that this is supposed to be a scientist in the back pocket of all of our undergraduates, it's unclear that they're really interested in that. It's unclear there's nothing to demonstrate that they have a good record of that
Mhm.
stewardship.
No.
And if they
Yeah.
were interested in that, why not roll it out in the same way that the internet had rolled out literally, whatever, like generations ago, which was
Hmm.
not to massify use from day one. It wasn't
Right.
scale all at once. It was
Right.
very, very staggered. I mean,
Yep.
initially, it was only large institutions and scientists and researchers and engineers that had any kind of access to this thing. There was still
Yep.
lots of social experimentation. I mean, the origins of BBSs and free software and all kinds of, we still had all kinds of interesting sort of user-based
Experiments.
innovations that happened,
Yeah.
even with that kind of just sort of staggered release. And so you could
Yep.
absolutely start to see what impacts and project where impacts would go. But without this, again, sort of just um,
Throw it out there.
onslaught. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's an assault. It really is a kind of assault.
Yep. Joy, do you have another question?
I do. So scientific publishing has been aligned with Silicon Valley since the internet started. It was kind of a natural pairing in some
Mm.
ways because especially journal content, it's coming out quickly and you want to get it out to as many people as you can. So adopting online technologies and platforms made sense. And so we're one sector of publishing that has been just a very fast follower with a lot of things and adopting a lot of consumer technology ideas to because we were well positioned to do that. And this was happening at the same time as a big movement towards open access and publishing as much as possible for free to the end user. We have no page restrictions, and we have no subscribers that we need to be beholden to. So that's just going to open the floodgates for more science at scale, platformed, and now data-based that is going to lead to this amazing breakthrough. And then now AI has come in as the next goal is now we're going to apply this AI to help all scientists become better scientists. And we're seeing so many more downsides than upsides. And just like a lot of things, we haven't seen the positive results. It's still just this open-ended, like we're gonna someday all move to Mars, and
Right.
achieve singularity dream.
Right.
Um, but in the meantime, what we're seeing are a lot of companies who are highly invested in not only the platforms but the AI, but also taking a lot of tech money in order to do this. Um, are now preaching this notion of responsible use of AI as if they know something that the rest of us don't. And so my question is there such a thing as responsible use of AI?
I mean, by and large, I mean, when it comes to when we hear our undergraduates sort of imagine that and project that, their notion of it is essentially like using the kind of products that are accessible to them already, and those are not responsible. I mean, the development of them has been quite irresponsible. And so the sort of largest sort of consumer facing products, I would say absolutely not.
Mhm.
The notion of what it means to kind of imagine another AI economy, I think is one that I take seriously in many ways because I work in the global South as well. And it's not an even it is not the same kind of discourse and dialogue and not the same sort of set of players who are agentialized or thinking around like what would it mean to sort of like think about an AI economy that's actually working for a kind of weather prediction and emergency and disaster prediction, or thinking about public health, but really with the specificities of like vulnerable populations and migrant populations and disenfranchised populations sort of at stake. But with these kinds of cases, in almost all of them, and you also hear about very, very kind of specific moves of indigenous populations also thinking about having their own version of practicing or thinking about an AI built in Maori or an indigenous language, etc. It's usually quite small scale, and the whole point of it, I think, in many ways, looks like not unlike what the kind of last chapter of my first book did, which was a kind of very intentional partnering with different interest groups and stakeholders who had already been in the kind of long work of justice and kind of social outreach, working in in language preservation or in indigenous community organizing and resourcing or indigenous media, etc. But doing that sort of on the ground relationship building, it's slow. It's not about monetization. The whole
Mhm.
objective of it is really about sort of kind of bringing in instead, quite intentionally, dialogue between youth populations and elder populations to try and think through what could this look like. Where would we
Mhm.
like to see some stewardship? And it's not about openness either. It's not about sort of releasing a tool and then saying, here is our gift to the world, as if
Right.
like indigenous populations have not already gifted. It is not about that at all.
Mhm.
And the sort of, I'll underscore that, the kinds of principles, data principles of organizations, decolonial and feminist organizations like GIDA, which is the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, that really sort of has pushed back on this notion that open data is always the ethical standpoint. I mean,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
for a decade, they have been very, very strong and cautioning um, against this sort of like just default mantra. And instead, again, sensitizing audiences and research audiences, especially to the way that this kind of notion, default notion of data for the last, whatever, multiple generations, not just in our kind of new tech economy, but has been
Mm-hmm.
used to kind of dispossess indigenous peoples and marginalized peoples from data that they could also have been included in terms of stewardship and empowerment, et cetera. So these smaller AI-based projects
Mhm.
exist. Um,
Mhm.
you know, we don't know where they'll go, except that they are invested in this kind of relationship, this practice of relationship renewal, and trying to fortify collectives and conversations at that point, which is why I kind of gesture towards this notion of like what might it mean, for instance, if our professional societies were to kind of really take seriously this question of like, what is the kind of problematics around authorship and submission and conference participation, et cetera? Like, what have been the series of long-standing problems that we as a professional society might sort of acknowledge and think about, and how we might sort of um, rethink the terrain and rethink different kinds of resources and infrastructures and technologies rather than just sort of throwing our hands up right now and leaving essentially a lot of young scientists and scientists in the global south, and not even, I mean,
Mhm.
many, many, researchers now are in this practice of thinking about, chat GPT and large LLMs as essentially tools and resources for their own professional development that they have to use, right? In the absence of other kinds of either spaces for and conversations for recourse. What might it look like if we instead started to kind of reframe the problem
Right.
and
Start to think for
reset some
ourselves, right?
expectations? Right. Yeah. I mean, the publication indexes and whatnot, all of those things have been, long issues that have needed long-standing conversation and rethinking, and they're really all
Mhm.
just getting diagnosed. I mean, this current moment around like the chat GPTification
Mhm.
research output, is bringing them all to the fore and sort of wanting to kind of reset and just say, now this is a new world we all live in. We all have to sort of face this as the problem.
Mhm.
There
Yeah.
really is another conversation that people are wanting to have.
Mhm.
That would also move us all away from this kind of default. Well, this is the kind of primary tool that researchers have to basically, think about their economic life, their professional livelihood.
Mhm.
Yep. All right. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. You spent a lot of time with us, and we really appreciate it. And these have been great answers. So, um, I just want to finish with one last question, and then maybe we'll get a discovery of the week. Maybe we'll see. Um, so, I reread some of your writings before the interview, and it seems like everything hits even harder today, and that there's a greater sense of urgency to all of these topics. And it feels like we've almost fallen into a trap and we need to claw our way out of it. I mean, is that a fair kind of distillation of the feeling
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, well, I will say that, I mean, part of the messaging is also to, if it's a trap, it's a sense that there have been so many opportunities for other kinds of institutional actors to act otherwise, including ones who feel themselves right now
Amen.
in this trap. And we have not taken those opportunities. Universities right now should not be, can be playing another kind of role other than just sort of leaning into this AI economy and telling their faculty, like, and interacting with them as if our job is to make AI companies happy.
Mm.
Designing data science programs and now sort of like AI professionalization programs, essentially as if that is our primary job. As if civic firms of actual intentional education and civic renewal were not the things that were actually precarious. And so yes, absolutely. I mean, if it's a trap, it's because we've sort of laid it for ourselves and not
We
and
kind
missed
of
out
let
on multiple
ourselves fall
opportunities.
into it, huh?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So now we're going to take a little pause. And do you think you have a discovery of the week?
I'm not sure how to discovery of the
Okay. All right. So now we're going to move on. So thank you. Thank you, Anita. That was fantastic. So now we're going to move on to discoveries of the week.
All right, I'll go first. Um, so I saw the most wonderful thing in my late night um, YouTube reel scrolling, and these were they were the reel was titled Paddle Pups. And these are wildlife detection dogs in Australia. And their speciality is that they're trained to detect different types of endangered wildlife. And these two dogs, their specialty is finding platypus nests. And so that the zoologists can go out, they're not disturbing the platypuses,
Platypi. Yeah.
platypi. They just want to know where they are. They want to be able to count them and make sure they're okay. So, as part of their data collection on preserving the species and understanding how the environment is treating them, but they found that these dogs can just find out where they're sleeping in the water from a paddleboard, and they don't have to touch them, but they can just count them and then move on.
Yeah. And the way the dogs change their posture when they find one.
Yeah.
The
Yeah. We'll
video,
put
it's
the video in.
amazing.
It's so
Yeah.
cute.
It's amazing. We'll put the
Great.
link to the video, but they like find one and they go, oh,
Oh, okay. One platypus. Check.
you got me? You got me? One platypus. It's pretty amazing. That's great. And I love it because it's science-based. So mine this week was less science-based, but still kind of historical. So I got invited to TD Garden to attend a preseason Bruins game. And I got there a little bit early and didn't want to just be the guy in the luxury box sitting around. So I walked the hall and they
As
were
you
doing
always are
construction.
the guy in the luxury box.
I know I'm always the guy in the luxury box. Yeah, yeah, like once every 5 years. But anyhow, so I walked down the hall and they're doing construction, and one of the very end luxury boxes open, wide open, and I look in, and lo and behold, it's the floored with the pieces of the old Boston Garden basketball parquet floor with screw
Mhm.
holes in it and the original paint and the original finish and all of this. And it's like I had seen Boston Celtics games on low res television back in the day when they had that floor in place, and they were always complaining about how eccentric the floor was and the bounces could be and all this stuff. Now you couldn't see enough to understand what it was, but then standing on top of this and seeing this the offset screw holes and the actual wood and the paint and how thick the paint was and all this, I'm like, okay, I now totally understand it. And it was just in a one of those things where, again, getting out of your screen time, it's like go out, explore the world. It's fantastic. And history is still just a great place to remind yourself that what you saw actually existed, and it was really cool. So that was my
Yay.
discovery of the week.
My discovery, can I pitch in a discovery of the week?
We would love
Mhm.
that.
Okay. I mean, this is going to be a little bit of a mundane story, but I'm going to say it nonetheless because I think it might be useful for like other faculty and educators is that and I was encouraged to share this story actually by another faculty member, but this semester, in this kind of moment of chat cheapification of like university campuses, I decided to go back to kind of old school Socratic method in my courses, and essentially now have students like read a hard printout kind of version of whatever it is that we're reading, excerpts from Virginia Eubanks and Catherine D'Ignazio, and works on data feminism and Settlement House data collection and all the rest of it, and Karen Howe, and so they literally, I asked them to print out the copy, or we hand out the copies of the hard printouts, and then have them, essentially come into class, and I do cold call Socratic method, like what was happening in this section of the article, and I have all, essentially 20 something more plus students essentially go through and kind of like break down the article of the argument of the article. And it has been really one of the most successful teaching experiments I think that I've had, since I've been on this campus, where the students literally like scrawl all over their printouts.
That's awesome.
And are really great actually at sort of doing the kind of delivery mode. And even though I think we have this narrative like overall that our students would resist because they're born digital, because they need to sort of constantly be in sort of digital tangibility, like some version of digital tactileness or non-tactileness. But exactly as Kent was saying, like getting back to like the analog world, letting them sort of appreciate what it actually means to do any version of cognitive processing, where they've got to sort of like be in contact with the ideas on the page and not just sort of let it kind of wash over. It lets them perform a really different version of themselves. And I don't know, I'll just say we were reading Karen Howe this week on the sort of datification and annotation economy in Kenya and Venezuela. And most students are not at all literate with decolonial politics. But by the end of the session, I literally had students asking me in reactions, why had I never read and been in contact with this kind of literature before? So yeah, it was a
That's
great,
fantastic.
yeah. So just an encouragement to our fellow.
That's right. Socrates had something. He was
Yeah.
onto something. Well,
That's awesome. We were
that's
talking about that a couple weeks ago because somebody was saying the only way to ensure that students are learning is to go back to the blue books
it was Clay
Yeah.
for
Shirky
the
of
exam.
all
Oh yeah,
people.
Clay Shirky. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
was saying, but have they even written longhand
Right. Yeah.
that long?
They can. They can.
Yeah.
But the other part,
Yeah.
whatever, which Clay Shirky, I don't love his work all the time. I was okay with this article. I did not love how he framed students,
Mm,
because he was essentially saying that students hate this, and they don't
yeah.
necessarily hate this. That's
No.
not, I mean, like we are giving them, that's the default knee-jerk mischaracterization of their generation, that they're so
Yeah.
in love with technology that they'll just swallow and eat up everything. And
Hmm.
Yeah.
much ambivalence is about it as we do. They've been surveilled since they were babies. They
Yeah.
just hate, I mean, like when you ask them about privacy rights and if they're okay with like tech companies using their data willy-nilly, and if they trust tech companies or they trust the government in terms of, that's mode of I mean, they are off the charts in terms of saying we don't trust them. Even though, I mean, they're users of all these things like we are, but I mean, we need a much more nuanced conversation around, youth and tech relations too. So,
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Anita. This was fantastic. We really appreciate it. All right. So now we're going to move on. So thank you. Thank you, Anita. That was fantastic. So now we're going to move on to discoveries of the week.
All right, I'll go first. Um, so I saw the most wonderful thing in my late night YouTube reel scrolling. And these were the reel was titled Paddle Pups. And these are wildlife detection dogs in Australia. And their speciality is that they're trained to detect different types of endangered wildlife. And these two dogs, their specialty is finding platypus nests. And so that the zoologists can go out, they're not disturbing the platypuses, platypuses,
Platypi.
platypi. They just want to know where they are. They want to be able to count them and make sure they're okay. So, as part of their data collection on preserving the species and understanding how the environment is treating them, but they found that these dogs can just find out where they're sleeping in the water from a paddleboard, and they don't have to touch them, but they can just count them and then move on.
Yeah, and the way the dogs change their posture when they find one.
Yeah.
The
Yeah. We'll
video,
put the
it's
video in.
amazing.
It's so
Yeah,
cute.
it's amazing. We'll put the
Great.
link to the video, but they like find one and they go, "Whoop,
Oh, okay. One platypus. Check.
you got me, you got me, one platypus." It's pretty amazing. That's great, and I love it because it's science based. So mine this week was less science based, but still kind of historical. So I got invited to TD Garden to attend a preseason Bruins game, and I got there a little bit early and didn't want to just be the guy in the luxury box sitting around. So I walked the hall and they
As
were
you
doing
always are
construction.
the guy in the luxury box.
I know I'm always the guy in the luxury box. Yeah, yeah, like once every 5 years. But anyhow, so I walked down the hall and they're doing construction, and one of the very end luxury box is open, wide open. And I look in, and lo and behold, it's the floored with the pieces of the old Boston Garden basketball parquet floor with screw
Mhm.
holes in it and the original paint and the original finish and all of this. And it's like I had seen Boston Celtics games on low res television back in the day when they had that floor in place. And they were always complaining about how, eccentric the floor was and the bounces could be and all this stuff. Now, you couldn't see enough to understand what it was. But then standing on top of this and seeing this, the offset screw holes and the actual wood and the paint and how thick the paint was and all this, I'm like, okay, I now totally understand it. And it was just one of those things where, again, getting out of your screen time, it's like go out, explore the world. It's fantastic, and history is still just a great place to remind yourself that you know what you saw actually existed, and it was really cool. So that was my
Yay.
discovery of the week.
My discovery, can I pitch in a discovery of the week?
We would love
Mhm.
that.
Okay. I mean, this is going to be a little bit of a mundane story, but I'm going to say it nonetheless because I think it might be useful for like other faculty and educators. Is that and I was encouraged to share this story actually by another faculty member, but this semester, in this kind of moment of chat cheapification of like university campuses, I decided to go back to kind of old school Socratic method in my courses,
Mhm.
and essentially now have students like read a hard printout kind of version of whatever it is that we're reading, excerpts from Virginia Eubanks and Catherine D'Ignazio, and works on data feminism and Settlement House data collection and all the rest of it, and Karen Howe. And so they literally, I asked them to print out the copy, or we hand out the copies of the hard printouts, and then have them, essentially they come into class and I do cold call Socratic method, like what was happening in this section of the article. And I have all, essentially 20 something more plus students essentially go through and kind of like break down the article of the argument of the article. And
Mhm.
it has been really one of the most successful teaching experiments I think that I've had, since I've been on this campus, where the students literally like scrawl all over their printouts.
That's awesome.
And are really great actually at sort of doing the kind of delivery mode. And even though I think we have this narrative like overall that our students would resist because they're born digital, because they need to sort of constantly be in sort of digital tangibility, like some version of digital tactileness or non-tactileness. But exactly as
Right.
Kent was saying, like getting back to like the analog world, letting them
Mhm.
sort of appreciate what it actually means to do any version of cognitive processing, where they've got to sort of like be in contact with the ideas on the page and not just sort of let it kind of wash over. It lets them perform a really different version of themselves. And I don't know, I'll just say we were reading Karen Howe this week on the sort of datification and annotation economy in Kenya and Venezuela. And most
Mm.
students are not at all literate with decolonial politics. But by the end of the session, I literally had students asking me in reactions, why had I never read and been in contact with this kind of
That's
literature before.
fantastic.
So yeah, it was a
That's
great,
fantastic.
yeah. So just an encouragement to our followers.
That's right. Socrates had something. He was
Yeah.
onto something. Well,
That's awesome. We were
that's
talking about that a couple weeks ago because somebody was saying the only way to ensure that students are learning is to go back to the blue books
it was Clay
Yeah.
for
Shirky
the
of
exam.
all
Oh yeah,
people.
Clay Shirky. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
was saying, but have they even written longhand
Right.
that
Yeah.
long?
They can. They
Yeah.
can. But the other part,
Yeah.
whatever, which Clay Shirky, I don't love his work all the time. I was okay with this article. I did not love how he framed students,
Mm,
because he was essentially saying that students hate this, and they don't
yeah.
necessarily hate this. That's
No.
not, I mean, like we are giving them, that's the default knee-jerk mischaracterization of their generation, that they're
Yeah.
so in love with technology that they'll just swallow and eat up everything. And
Hmm.
Yeah.
much ambivalence is about it as we do. They've been surveilled since they were babies. They
Yeah.
just hate, I mean, like when you ask them about privacy rights and if they're okay with like tech companies using their data willy-nilly, and if they trust tech companies or they trust the government in terms of, that's motive, I mean, they are off the charts in terms of saying we don't trust them. Even though, I mean, they're users of all these things like we are, but I mean, we need a much more nuanced conversation around, youth and tech relations too. So,
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Anita. This was fantastic. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to our friends at Provoke the Truth for the music. And as always, let us know what you think. You can reach us at disruptedscience@gmail.com. And if you like our merch shirt, you can look up where to buy that too. So we'll put a link in the show notes. All right. Thanks, everybody. See you,
All
Joy.
right. Bye.